Welcome back to the Candid Christianity podcast, where we talk practical Jesus living for the other 6 days of the week. Today, we are continuing on in a 3-part series from our Engage conference we hosted a couple weeks ago. This is part 2. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, you're going to want to make your way back to that one and listen to it first. It's going to give you some really good foundational stuff to continue to build on this week's episode. So enjoy, and I hope you engage.
All right, good morning, everybody. Hope everybody had a great night's sleep. I woke up this morning, beautiful blue sky, mountains in the background, and I went, this is okay. So Dallas is flat, Dallas is boring. So it was nice to see the mountains white-capped in the background. Of course, you guys, my understanding is that snow lingers here. Okay, snow is an abstract idea in Dallas, all right? We may get one snow every winter, and it's usually just a little dust of snow. It doesn't always stick, and so even our snows are boring. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with y'all. Today, I've got 2 sessions. The first is going to be about how we talk, so let's talk about how we talk. I call this talk difficult conversations, how to have difficult conversations and have a chance that those conversations will go well. So I'm going to look at how conversations work. I'm going to talk about the things we do that damage conversations, the things we can do to advance conversations. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how I see conversations in the public square. So that will be what we'll do first, and then we'll take a break and let everybody get fueled up, and then we'll deal with kind of the Back to the Future talk, how the various ways Christians have said, how do you cope with pluralism? What are different approaches to think about, as well as taking a look at some texts and Acts that show how the early church did it. So that's where we're headed. So with that in mind, I'm going to start off with Sesame Street, okay? Because every academic talk needs to appeal to Sesame Street at one point or another. And you know that Sesame Street, you probably, if you're a parent like me, at some point you were watching Sesame Street on a regular basis as a way of showing that you cared about your kid. And you know, they had the word for the day. So the word for today is triphonics. Okay, I'm sure you've used it on your everyday speech all the time. It's one of the most popular terms ever devised by humanity. So what does triphonics mean? What triphonics means is that there are 3 channels operating simultaneously. I'm so glad I've got some people with gray hair in the room because they understand me, all right? So remember stereo speakers? Okay, right? Stereo, two different sounds coming out of 2 different speakers, and the idea was the mix would make the sound richer. And then we promoted from stereo to quadraphonic sound. Remember that? That's 4 speakers. And they're coming at you in different directions with what it is that they have to say. Well, triphonics is the idea that all important conversations operate on 3 channels simultaneously. And the trick with this is that of the 3 channels, what you think you're talking about and what's really going on are actually 2 different things. So here is the slide to indicate that. Here are the 3 channels of any conversation. And right now I'm talking about we could be in public space. We could be in your living room with your spouse. We could be with your kids, with your relatives. It doesn't matter. All conversations have this dimension to them. And they are the topic that you're talking about, which is where people tend to focus. Now, this is what the conversation's about. It's what we're talking about. But subterranean, underneath what you're talking about, are 2 other things going on. They're also broadcasting at the same time. And the premise that I have for you today is they're actually controlling the conversation. What's happening underneath. Not the topic, but what's going on underneath. The second channel that is broadcasting is the lens that you see the world with. Okay? The lens that you see the world with. how you process what's in front of you. Now, I get to illustrate this, and this is the easiest illustration I get to do in any of the talks that I give. Because all I have to do to illustrate lenses is to go CNN and Fox. Okay? That's all I have to do, go CNN and Fox, and you know what I mean by lenses. Because everybody's got the same reality out there that they're looking at. We're all looking at the same stuff, but we aren't seeing the same stuff. In fact, if you talk to someone at CNN and talk to someone at Fox at what they're looking at, and then you hear what their conclusion is about what it is that you're seeing, you go, do these people live on the same planet? It's that different. And that's the lens that they're taking what it is that they're seeing through. And that is actually a controller in a conversation. And so we're talking about conversations in which people's lenses differ. And therefore what they take in is impacted by that. And lenses do two things at once. This is the trick of lenses. Lenses cause you to focus on certain things, but in the process of focusing on certain things, you may miss certain things that are out there. So they have a positive and a negative effect on what's out there because they cause me to be drawn to certain things and to pay special attention to those. And in the midst of being that focused, sometimes I miss other things that are going on. That's how lenses work. And so that's a second element of a conversation. The third element may even be more important than the second. And that is how my identity and my interests are tied into what it is that I'm seeing. How my identity or interests are tied in or impacted by what we're talking about. Every conversation is being driven ultimately at that lower level in terms of how it's being processed. Now, to get to this third level, I have to illustrate it for you. And to illustrate it for you, I have to tell you that I was born with a gift. The gift that I was born with was the ability to multitask. And you already heard that I'm a sports fan. So when I was growing up, my gift, my ability to multitask, drove my mother crazy. Because on a Saturday, I would be listening to multiple sporting events at the same time. I would have 3 radios going. I might be listening to 2 baseball games and a basketball game or something like that. Today it might be a soccer game, a basketball game, and a baseball game all at the same time. And I have the radios going so I could listen and there'd be this cacophony of sound coming out of my room that would drive my mother absolutely batty. Now I have to tell you that I kind of enjoyed it, okay? All right, that I impacted her this way. You know how kids can push parents' buttons? I knew which buttons to push, and I was gifted in this regard. So it was really a nice situation. So she would come in and she would say, turn down one of those radios or 2 of those radios. There's no way you can know what's going on. And that became the moment of truth in the hour of decision. Because I had the option about how I responded to her, and I could prove to her I had the gift. I could tell her what the score was on each one of the games. I'm following all 3 of these. I'm plugged in. I've got the gift. Now I can tell you that when I did this did not actually please my mother, okay, to tell her that I was gifted, and then to be able to demonstrate it. This did me very little good in the long run, okay? But sometimes, just to prove that I had the gift, I would do this. And then my wife married the gift. And now the issue wasn't the radio. Now the issue was my computer screen. And I would be working along, and she would come in, and she would talk to me and say something to me. And in the midst of saying something to me, because I had the gift, I could concentrate on what was in front of me, and I could listen to her, and she could say, "You're not listening to me." Now, that's the topic, but that's not what's driving the conversation. Because the moment she says that, there are 2 things going on between us, And what's going on with her and what's going on with me are not the same thing. What's going on with me is she just accused me of being a bad husband. Okay? That's the identity level thing. She just accused me of being a bad husband, so how am I going to handle this? In the meantime, her point of view is, I'm not important enough to you for you to give me your undivided attention. Which is also an identity thing. All right? And we are not on the same page. Okay? And my gift doesn't help. I could prove to her, in fact, I do this sometimes, because I like to push her buttons sometimes too. Okay? I could prove to her, I heard every word you said. I have the ability to parrot back to her word for word what she said. And she said, you're not listening, to which I asked the question, so how is it possible I'm able to parrot back to you word for word what you said to me? Because we're not talking about listening. We're talking about attention. We're talking about focus. We're talking about, is she more important and what she says to me more important than what's on my screen? That's what she's concerned about. Meanwhile, I'm trying to use my time efficiently. Okay? I have a gift. I can do two things at once. If I do two things at once, that's less things I have to do later. Okay? I mean, the logic of everything is really wonderful. It just doesn't mesh. And so that's where we are. So that's the way conversations work. And anyone who's done any marital counseling knows this. I've got pastors in the room. They've done marital counseling. They will tell you in 2 seconds, it's not what you're fighting about. It's what underneath. It's what's underneath that you're fighting about. That's really what you're fighting about. It usually has to do with control and relationship and respect. Those kinds of things that impact the way. And public conversations are the same way. They're the same way. So these are the three components of any conversation. The topic, the lens that you use to get there, and people use different lenses, and the identity and interests that are why that person is in that conversation in the way that they are. And that is true across the board. That's the way conversations work. And what it means is what you are talking about and what's driving that conversation are not the same thing. And you just need to be aware of that as you have these conversations. Which, to go back to yesterday, is why getting a spiritual GPS reading is so important. Because the spiritual GPS reading is digging down for that lower layer. It's trying to explain where that person is coming from, where they're grounded, what their lenses are, that impacts how they see the topic that you're talking about and drives the way they're processing what's being said to them. All that's worth knowing. Triphonics, word for the day. Now you got to go out and use it in 10 sentences between now and next week. All right. Next one. Next question is, what kind of a listener are you? Someone said one of the things they learned from last night is we need to be better listeners. Okay? That's one of the main points that I had last night, and that is the main point this morning. Okay? How to be a better listener. What kind of listener are you? Now, there's a litmus test for this. It is really, really easy to determine whether you are a good listener or a bad listener. And by a bad listener, I mean whether you're in the conversation to have a conversation or whether you're in the conversation to have a debate. If I'm in the conversation to have a conversation, and if I'm a good listener, when people are talking to me and sharing with me what they think, what I want to be doing is formulating questions based upon what they've said to me. That's what I want to do. If I want to have a debate, what I'm forming is my rebuttal while they're talking to me. Their tilt meter goes off, and they go, here's my response. I'm going to block that idea, and we're going to engage. So you're either a rebutter, debater, or you're a listener. And you can tell. It's just easy to tell which mode you are in any conversation that you are having. So I'm suggesting to you that one of the ways to advance a conversation and keep it from turning into a debate is to pursue it like a conversation and not pursue it like a debate, which means you're going to be asking questions and engaging the person on what they're saying to you. And you're doing it not with the idea of rebutting them, but simply with the idea of getting more information about where they are and why, because you're trying to dig down to those lower layers that actually are controlling the conversation. You're trying to get the conversation into that space. Now, I told you last night what the passage was, what the biblical passage was that's driving this conversation. We're supposed to be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger, because the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God. And now we're going to do a culture check. How much anger do we see around us today? I heard someone say lots. Yeah. Maybe James 1, 19 and 20 has something to say to us about how we conduct ourselves, how we think about the tone with which we conduct ourselves. And so that's the background for what we're going to do. Now I'm going to go to 5 things that sabotage conversations. And here they are. Here's the list. 5 things that we do that kill conversations. And I will tell you that you don't have to look hard for these things. They are on constant demonstration 24/7. Usually all you have to do is turn on your television and go to a panel where people disagree. And you will see what I'm about to mention. You will see all of them in one form or another. And they are conversation killers. And so I'm going to work through them one at a time. The first is what I call the quick confession and pivot. I know about this because I've worked with public relations firms, because I do a lot of public speaking, and sometimes I'm doing a lot of interviewing with the media. So we have a public relations firm that the seminary hires, and they've taught me how to keep, the conversation on point, okay? Make sure that you get to talk about what you want to talk about. Don't talk about what they want to talk about. And so you are taught the maneuver called the pivot. The pivot is when you get asked a question you don't want to answer, okay? When someone is making a point that exposes a pressure point in what you believe. Okay? And they bring that up. And they bring that up to you. And your goal is to pivot as quickly as you can to what you want to talk about and not what they want to talk about. Okay? So, I don't know who's got a phone to call or whatever, but thank you. So the challenge is to get to what you want to talk about and not what they want to talk about. So I want to break this down a little bit for you. So the quick confession and pivot is one way of handling this, which is someone brings up a point that you don't want to talk about and that exposes a problem or a weakness or an issue in what you're holding, and you engage in what I call the quick confession, and then you pivot. No, you know what? That's a good point. You're right, but let's talk about this. Okay? So it is the reply, and then the key word that tells you you're pivoting is the word but. Okay? Sometimes when I'm in conversations and someone plays this card on me, I go, no, let's stop. Let's not do the but yet. Let's talk about the front half of this. Okay? Because the moment you pivot, you have actually communicated disrespect to the person you're talking with. They're raising a point they want to focus on and talk about, and maybe for good reason. And you don't want to talk about it, so you want to get off it as quick as you can, but in the process, you're disrespecting them in the conversation. So that's the quick confession and pivot. Sometimes this is called gaslighting, okay? Where an issue is coming at you and you gaslight it. You change it in such a way that you don't address what's in front of you. You take the conversation somewhere else. Now, let me say this. Everything that I am sharing with you is done by everybody. Okay? We're all very good at this. These are not political categories that are right and left. These are human categories about how we talk about one another and how we engage with one another and what we do to undercut our conversations with one another. The quick confession and pivot is one of the most popular maneuvers that is done today because I guarantee you politicians have been taught it. Okay? I know because I was taught it. That's the first one. The second one is what I call demonization or the exorcism. Okay, this is debate by label. Okay, and it's an equal opportunity employer. Okay, both the left and the right do it. And what I do is I label you. And if I can label you, and I can label you with a bad label, okay, then this is the result. The goal is to bury you, to label you and bury you. If I can label you and turn you into a bad thing, okay, then I don't have to engage with you on what it is we're talking about. And that's what that does. And so I call it demonization or the exorcism because this is how it works. All right, so we're going to go to exorcist class. And what I want to show you is it's an equal opportunity employer. This is how it works. C, conservative. L, liberal. F, fundamentalist. W, woke. That's the newest one. Okay? I label you. And I label you in such a way that the topic doesn't need to be engaged. If you analyze almost all our political commercials, this is what they do. They label the opponent as a way of dismissing them. And you ask why our civil discourse is so weak. It's because we don't engage. We label and move on. This is also very, very disrespectful. Because it says, I can label you and not pay attention to what it is that you're raising. That's the second thing that we do that kills conversations. The third one is what I call the prophetic gift. It is motive assignment. I say something to you or you say something to me, and I tell you why you said that to me. I don't engage on what it is that you said. I tell you why you said that to me, and the motive is usually negative. So it's a way of dismissing the content of what the person says by saying, I know you have a bad motive in raising this, so I don't need to engage it. That's the way it works. And I call it the prophetic gift because you better be right about the motive. Because if you're wrong about the motive, you know what you have committed? You've committed slander. So, this is a tricky one because it's a way of justifying where we're coming from and again, kind of pushing the other person away in terms of what they are raising. And if I am wrong, I have really disrespected the conversation. That's the third one. The fourth one is never, 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 never. You know this gig. Never, never, never. That's emphatic. Surrender. Don't surrender any ground on any level of the conversation because that shows weakness. And the one thing you don't want to do, you don't want to lose the conversation, you don't want to show weakness, you don't want to acknowledge that the other side has anything to offer to the conversation. And the moment you do that, you've cut off the conversation. Because you say the only thing that counts is what I believe. Most conversations are sufficiently complex that there is something coming from the other point of view that needs attention. So when we create a raw binary, which is what this does, okay? My side is all good, their side is all evil. The moment I create a raw binary, I have removed any reason to have a conversation with anyone on the other side of the conversation. And that's a conversation killer, just a slight observation. That kills the conversation. Because there's the non-recognition that there might be something coming from the other. I may spin it differently than they do, but it might be worth a conversation to talk about it. And this ends up dismissing it. The moment I am not willing to acknowledge that I am not omniscient, the moment that I'm unwilling to acknowledge that, I am in the mood of killing a conversation. The last one is just raw tribalism. And actually, 5 contributes to 4. Tribalism is, I've got to defend my tribe at all costs. Doesn't matter what they've done or how they've done it, my tribe can never be wrong. It is number 5 that has cost the church a ton of credibility in the last 10 years. Because the church has ended up defending things that 10 and 15 years ago they said were basic. And the only reason it's being done is to protect the tribe and to protect the approach, an approach that I might agree with. And it becomes the ends justifies the means. And when the ends justifies the means, you blow your integrity and credibility by crossing a line that before you said you would never cross. Those are the 5 things we do to sabotage conversations. All of us do them. They are not red or blue, okay? They're just there. And we all do them. We'll have time for confession later. All right? We'll have a Roman Catholic moment. We'll all confess, okay, and repent and move on. Okay, so if we're not going to sabotage conversations, how do we help them? What can we do to help conversations and move them along? First is be vulnerable. Own your own stuff. Now, that's against the idea of giving any ground on anything. Okay? It's okay. It might be okay for me to admit that there are certain things that I do that aren't the best. I tell people that in the environment that we're in today, what we have done is we have set a low bar. Here's the low bar that we've set. We have said, the view that I have is better than those other guys. And they're bad. Okay? So if I'm just a little bit better than bad, I'm okay, I'm good. That's the wrong conversation, ladies and gentlemen. The right conversation is, how can we be the best we can be? What should we be doing? What should be the standard? What should we go after? It isn't just that I beat the other guys by a nose, or even I beat them by a few links. It is, what should we be as a people, and what should we be pursuing, and what's good for our society as a whole? And we should be pursuing that and not say, well, we're better than the other guys, and that's the alternative. That sets a minimum standard. And so you want to be vulnerable, you want to own your own stuff, you want to own your own stuff in such a way that there's a recognition that there are some things on your side of the conversation that may need work. That none of us is perfect, that none of us is omniscient, that there probably are a few things that I believe in which I just might be, take some oxygen, wrong. Second, be curious with open ears. Be curious with open ears. What drives good questioning, asking good questions in conversations is a good, healthy dose of curiosity. I want to understand why you believe that. I am curious as to what led you to think that way. What are the sources or what are the voices that you're listening to? And you're just asking for information when you're asking these questions. You're getting that spiritual GPS reading. Third, stick to the issues, avoid personal attack. Avoid demonization. Some of these are the opposite of the things that we saw, the sabotage conversations. So I'm not going to accuse you of being something. I'm going to interact with the details that you bring up. Takes a little more work. I'll be honest, it's easier. Exorcism is easy. Okay? I use the label and I walk away. Exorcism is easy. Engagement is work. Some of us don't want to work. Be humble. Be humble. Be respectfully honest. Now, this fifth one's important to me because I can be misunderstood. I am not saying to bury your convictions. If you're hearing me say that, you haven't heard me. I want to engage on differences. I want to move beyond mere toleration that says, well, you are the way you are and I am the way I am, and that's the end of it. No, I want to engage on those differences, but I want to be honest about that, and I want to bring a certain tone to that conversation. And I want to engage in a certain kind of way that has me treat the person as I might wish to be treated by them. I want to exemplify what this conversation should be like as we have it. Which means I'm not only concerned about what I say and the truth of what I say, but how I say it. And so I want to be respectful. When someone asks me what I think, I will tell them what I think, but I will try and do so in a way that gives attention to how can I say this in such a way that this has a chance of being heard and not just rejected. 6, this is a hard one. Learn to parse the issues. Parsing is a term we have in language where we're picking apart the pieces of a word so we know how it functions. I know I'm dealing with a singular or a plural. I know I'm dealing with a noun or a verb. That's you parse when you do that. Parsing issues is knowing the issues. Many issues have layers to them. They aren't one-dimensional. There are several things going on at once. And when you learn to parse the issues, you learn that there's this layer and this layer and this layer and this layer. And then you might also learn, if I change my view about layer number 3, I might change my view overall. It's learning how to break down issues and parse them. And I think, I tell my students when they're thinking theologically that they need to have, and I'm sorry for the illustration, but it's a technical one. In our New Testament, there are textual variants as to what the wording should be. And there's a thing called the apparatus at the bottom. And the apparatus at the bottom tells us what the variant is and what manuscripts are witnessing to it. And then it has a little code off to the side, and it goes A, B, C, or D. The editors of the text have told us how difficult a decision they think this is between the choices. A is, we're absolutely certain this is the wording of the text. B is, we know there's a difference, but we're pretty confident. C is, we put this in the text, but the variant might be right. And D is, let's be honest, neither of us knows, but we had to put something. Okay? So it's a spectrum. It's a spectrum. I tell my students, you need to have an awareness of your judgments, and you need to put them on such a scale. A is, I'm so certain with this, I'd argue with God about it. Okay? That's a high level of certainty. Okay, I'll come back to that one. All right? B is, I know there's a difference, but I'm pretty confident I'm right. C is, if we get to heaven and I find out you're right, I actually won't be surprised. And D is, let's flip a coin and be honest, neither of us knows. And that's the spectrum. And as I deal with issues and layers, some things are A's, some things are B's, some things are C's, and some things are D's. And different layers may have different ratings. And what that does is it opens up the possibility that you have an awareness that there are certain places where a real conversation, might even be necessary. Now let me talk about the A category, because I have fun with the A category. My exemplar of category A is Peter, the Apostle Peter. Apostle Peter was so certain of certain things that he argued with God about it. Okay? 2 incidents I have in mind. When Jesus confessed that the Messiah was going to suffer, okay, Peter's initial reaction was, no way. The Messiah doesn't suffer. He had a Jewish view of the Messiah. Messiah comes and brings victory. He's going to win. He's going to conquer the enemy. And so Peter went to Jesus when he said the Son of Man was going to suffer and said, no, this is not going to happen. And Jesus complimented him on his remark and said, get behind me, Satan. That was a compliment. It was a negative compliment, but it was a compliment. Yeah? You've stated pretty clearly what you think, and you think you're right, and you're even willing to challenge me on it. But guess what? You're wrong. Second time it happened is in Acts. In Acts, Peter is experiencing a vision, and he has all this unclean food come down and put before him, right? And he gets there, and the voice from heaven says, eat this. You can have pork. Okay? I'm so glad this is in the Bible, by the way. I love barbecue. Okay? All right? So you can have pork. Peter, I have never, kill, slaughter, and eat. That's what it said. Okay? All right? Yeah. So, put the pork on the spit. You can go for it. No. I've never eaten anything unclean. Peter was obstinate. God did it again. And on the third time, as he was doing it, there was a knock at the door, and there were a group of Gentiles that said, hey, is the Apostle Peter here? We'd like to have him come to our home and share the gospel with Gentiles. Ooh, those bad guys. Yeah, we're going to share the gospel with Gentiles. Why in the world was he getting that vision? He was getting that vision because food practices and things like it were getting between Jews and Gentiles. And God wanted to change the way they were relating to one another. And so Peter went to Cornelius' house, and the first thing God gave me a vision, and he showed me that anyone who fears God can have access to God. Changed his view. But he was pretty certain about it at one point. So certain he would argue, no, God, I'm not going to, I know you told me to eat, and I know you're God, but I'm not eating. Okay? I love Peter. Okay? What goes in his head comes out his mouth. Does not pass go. It does not collect $200. It is a direct line. Okay? Makes Peter a great personality in the Scripture. Parse the issues. Take the time to do that. 7. I can't tell you how important this one is. Look for shared values or gospel openings. Look for shared values or gospel openings. When you're asking questions and you're getting that spiritual GPS reading and someone shares a value that you can connect with as a Christian, latch onto it. They may apply it differently than you do, okay? But what it becomes is a hook for a conversation. Look for shared value or gospel openings in life choices and issues of location, etc. People, here's another thing I mentioned this to someone last night. If you do not believe that there's a God and you do not know why you are here and you do not know how to make sense out of life and you do not think life has an order and a structure to it, what's going to be your default position? You're going to define what makes life work for you. That's exactly what's happening in our world. I tell people where people go outside the church is a natural place to go believing what they believe. We shouldn't be surprised. It's a natural place to... If there is no truth out there, if there is no structure to the creation, if there's no order to what's going on, if we are just here and then we are gone, then the only life that makes sense is the life I construct for myself. That's where our world is. It shouldn't surprise us. It's the default for not believing that there's a structure and an order to the creation. So sometimes I might want to acknowledge, I get that. I get that, but that's not the way to see the world. Because now you're playing with lenses. In the end, when you're creating categories that people don't have, you are playing with lenses. And you're trying to say, you know what? A little stop at the eye doctor to get some contact lenses may not be a bad idea. Might help you see better. All right, those are the 7 things that help conversations. Now, shifting gears again, this is a potpourri of kind of different categories. There are 3 types of issues in our public space. Now, my hope is this helps you think about these conversations that you're going to have when you move into political and shared space. There are 3 kinds of issues that are out there. They belong in 3 different classes. I wrote a book before the 2016 election. I was not responsible for the title of the book. The title of the book that the publisher picked for me, it's the only time I did not follow my instincts and agreed with the publisher to do something I was not entirely comfortable with. And the title of the book became, How Would Jesus Vote? Which I go, I don't want that as the title of the book, but How Would Jesus Vote? Okay, I said, I don't want that as the title of a book, but I agreed to it. And, bad moment of reflection. Anyway, but I was analyzing how issues work, but I wrote the book too early. The other thing was not only to get a bad title, I wrote the book too early. Because it was after I wrote the book I realized, there's a way to classify this that actually works and makes sense and is easier to get your hands around than just going issue by issue. And this is the classification I came up with after I wrote the book. And it is this. There are 3 kinds of issues. There are worldview clashes, there's shared goal, different paths, and then there are solid values in conflict. Those are the 3 kinds of issues that we meet in public space. Worldview clashes are issues where the starting points are so distinct and different, it's actually very hard to find common ground, and it's very hard to have a good common ground conversation. Because the starting points are so different. What's interesting is the 2 issues that belong in this bucket, in my view, are the discussions on abortion and the discussions on sexuality. That's why they're hard conversations. Because they're coming from completely different places in terms of how you start. The person who is interested in pro-life is talking about life beginning at the moment of conception, and the person who is engaged in being pro-choice usually has 2 sets of concerns. One is we don't know when life begins. That's the response to the pro-life position. And secondly, this is an issue of my conscience and it's none of your business. It's my body. It's none of your business. Okay? That's where the pro-choice people are coming. Those starting points are so distinct, it makes it very, very hard to have a good, solid conversation on that issue. That's why that issue is so challenging in public. The sexuality discussion is the same. It has very different starting. God has made us, Genesis 1, God has made us male and female. Okay? For a Christian, that's kind of the end of the discussion. God has made us male and female. End of story. For someone who thinks sexuality is a choice because of the way I choose to live my life, and there are certain things that incline me to maleness or femaleness, okay? Different starting point. Hard conversation. The trick here is that people put other issues in this category that may not belong there. And the moment you're in this category, you are in a hard binary conversation usually. Second category, shared goal, different paths. Shared goal, different paths. I put the race conversation in this category. And the reason I do is if I walk out on the street and ask this question, should the races be reconciled to one another? Okay, if I put the ideal about the way we should get along out there, most people, an extreme majority would say, yes, the races should be reconciled to one another. Those numbers would be so high, a politician would say, man, I'd love that approval number. I ask a second question, and the conversation begins. So how do we get there? How do we get there? That's going to be a different path. People are going to have different ideas about how we get to that reconciliation, but at least we share the same goal. We know we're reaching for the same outcome. That's a different conversation than category 1. Just is. The bulk, the majority, the larger number of issues that we have in the public square are not category 1 or category 2, they are category 3. Here is category 3. We live in a fallen world. The world is dysfunctional. It is not aligned. It is dysfunctional. A fallen world is dysfunctional. I'm translating the term fallen, and I'm translating the effects of sin. The effects of sin are such that our creation, our world is out of balance. Because it is out of balance, it is possible that virtues that exist in our world do not align, they collide. Because things are out of whack. Most of our political issues, I would submit, are conversations about values that are colliding. And each political party is picking the value that they lift up, and they try and neuter the value that's colliding with it. And so one political party says, this is the value that matters, and here's where I park and have my stake. And the other political party says, no, here's the value that I value, this is where I park and I have my stake. And I try and neuter the value that the other party has selected, and I have a difficult conversation. And we never ask the question we should ask when we're in that mode, which is, how do I acknowledge the value that is colliding with the value that I hold, and what should the alignment be? Because the assumption is they're out of line. They're not balanced. My example here is immigration. Immigration. There are values that are being espoused on each end that each have merit. A country ought to have a right to expect its laws to be followed and to determine what kind of society it wants to be. That's part of being a nation. There's nothing surprising or radical about that. That's what a people and a society ought to be able to do and be, and they ought to be able to expect their laws to be followed. There also is a value, even a biblical value, about compassion and understanding people who are oppressed and under pressure, and what it means if they are under, and how to make provision for them. That's a competing value, and they don't align. And it's even worse in our situation, because in our last major set of immigration laws were in 1984. That's a while ago. Okay, I was young in 1984. Okay, that was a while ago. I had hair in 1984. All right, so I know it was a long time ago. All right? And for more than 20 years, we said to people outside our country, come here and do the jobs that we don't want to do. And we protected them by not following our laws. We had our laws written, but we weren't following them. We invited them in. We had them do our laws. We linked and blinked at our own laws. We let them be here. We protected them. They had children. And then about 10, 12, 15 years ago, we changed the rules on them. Here's the question. What moral responsibility do we have for having done that in this conversation? That's a competing out-of-whack value in the conversation on immigration. And so however we solve it, however we go about dealing with it, and it needs to be solved and we need to take a look at it, the how we do it is as important as the what we are doing. And when I look around at our political situation and the nature of our political discourse, we're more interested in the what than we are the how. And the how is usually the relational level that from a Christian point of view is supposed to matter one heaven of a lot. Gun control, another example. I would have the right to protect my home and protect my family. I get that. Okay? But do we really need machine guns? And the whole militia argument, what do we do with that? Etc. How do we balance the collision of values? And what conversation do we need to have that doesn't say, I'm going to pick this value and I'm going to ignore that one, versus saying, how do we bring these into a better societal alignment that's best for all of us? That's what's going on in our public space. If you realize that most issues are in category 3 versus category 1, or even category 2, you put yourself in a better position to have a conversation with someone who disagrees with you politically. Because you can talk about the values that drive them and the values that drive you, and you may actually recognize some merit in the value that's driving someone else, even though they may apply it differently than you do. And you have the basis for a conversation that isn't quite so heated. So, here's some principles. I'm about to wrap up. Learn to recognize we all make judgments about what to prioritize, and that in many cases, core identity concerns drive the judgments that motivate our choices. Now I'm applying what I said at the beginning of the hour to the end. What causes us to align to these issues and to pick the virtues that we do vis-a-vis someone else is probably our identity and interests that are driving those choices. Listening helps us see what is driving someone else, and that inevitably makes for a better conversation, because to really assess the conversation that I'm having, I better understand the conversation that I'm having. And sometimes we leap to assessment without working through the understanding phase, and the understanding phase can actually put us in a better position to have a better conversation. Even if the conversation results in, you know what, this is where we disagree. We just see this differently. And we both understand that now. The other thing that I'm saying to you, engagement in this kind of way, where listening is a priority, builds respect and trust. And in the long run, you're in the business of helping people create categories they currently do not have. And the way you do that isn't just by your intellectual engagement, it's by your relational connection. Because if they get to the point where they trust and respect you, they just might listen to something that you have to say that they haven't thought about. Or if they've thought about it, they've only thought about it in one way. All right, that's difficult conversations. Stop and take some questions, and then we'll take a little break. Haven't quite gone an hour, so we're good for time. Take about 20, 25 minutes for questions. We'll give you a break, and then at 10:30 we'll go to round 3. Questions?
So I was listening to a podcast, and it was an atheist talking to 2 pastors. And what he brought up was, how can they believe in a God that wiped out everybody in Jericho and Ai? And for his own people, he'd send them a prophet and ask them to repent before he killed them. But these people, he didn't. And you know, when I read the Old Testament, I have trouble with that too, with God wiping out women, children, everything. How would you answer that question if somebody asked you that?
Okay, this is a whole weekend in and of itself. This is the problem of evil staring us in the face and how God deals with it, etc. The situation when Israel took the land was an exceptional situation. The judgment at the end will be an exceptional situation. What both of those scenes underscore is a point I made yesterday, which is that everyone is accountable to God, whether they recognize it or not, for the decisions that they make. The culture that was being judged, because that's what's happening in Joshua, Judges. The culture that was being judged had things like child sacrifice. I remember being in seminary, because these passages bothered me as well. I remember being in seminary and reading through the first 5 books of the Bible and reading through the practices of this culture, and in which you had temple prostitution on the one hand and you had child sacrifice on the other. And I'm sitting here, and the more I'm reading the impact of this culture on the cultures around it, and I'm sitting here going, you know what, this isn't a neutral culture, this is a pretty bad culture. And God decided he's going to show his judgment power by what he's asking Israel to do. Hard? Yes. But not out of the blue. And so, and as I said, it's an exceptional situation. You know, God doesn't treat us the way we deserve. If God treated us the way we deserved, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Okay? So yes, it's harsh. Part of the reason it's harsh is we are not convinced sometimes about what it is that we deserve. And so that makes it hard. And in our culture definitely is not convinced about that. So that's part of the problem. But the problem of evil is a major problem. I mean, the issues, you have issues of the Holocaust. There are all kinds of things you can bring up about the way in which God... And here in the end, I think, is the core answer. The very person who is challenging the way God works in that world does not want to have the choice that God has given them by making them a moral agent and making them in the image of God and making them accountable for the choices that they make. The very fact that you're raising that question tells me you have questions about the ability that you've been given to reason your way as a rational being to a better life and a better world. And that's sometimes hard for people to see, but it actually is the case. The person who says, ask yourself, who's responsible for the Holocaust? People. We actually can do that to one another. Who's responsible for the kind of war and conflict that we are seeing either in the Ukraine or in Gaza? People. We are capable of that. Our depravity is real and deserves judgment. And so that harsh, realistic view of reality, some people do not want to process. So I'm not saying this is an easy truth, because it isn't. But it's a true truth. And sometimes what is hard needs to be recognized in order to be appreciated. So yes, when I see some of the judgment and the way we treat one another, etc., and some of the stuff that goes on in Scripture, I go, that's not easy. But it comes with a backstory. It comes with a backstory. This culture that was judged in Joshua and Judges was worthy of being judged. And what God was trying to do was to say, if we can wipe out the presence of this corrupt influence in the land will be a better place. They didn't do it, and guess what they've been living with ever since? A mess. Yes.
So you've talked a lot about making sure to keep the other people on the defense and not being on the defense, and kind of asking like probing questions.
Not what I've said. Okay, so I've got to deal with the premise. I haven't said that my goal is not to put people on the defense or the offense. My goal is to have a conversation.
Okay.
So I'm not interested in the offense or defense part of this. I'm interested in the conversation. Go ahead and ask your question.
So after you've kind of probed to the deeper levels and kind of understood where people are coming from, when should you come in with some of your own ideas and presenting your own worldview?
When it's your turn to speak. Okay? You're in a conversation, right? You're going to have a turn to speak. You have an opportunity to speak. You might say, I appreciate this value that you're talking about, and this is how you talk about it and apply it. I actually share that value, but here's how I apply it. Okay? And you have a conversation. And you may end up having to say, person, you know what? You see it this way, and I see it that way. We knew before we came in this conversation we didn't agree with one another, but let's figure out what it is exactly we disagree about. Okay? And you can pursue it that way. You can make a statement that has mixed in it a kind of question to pursue jointly. Okay? That can help. That can help. The more precise you can be about the nature of your disagreement, the more focused and better your conversation will be. So you do it when it's your turn. Your turn. You will get a turn. Believe me, you'll get a turn. Okay? You're in a conversation unless you're talking to someone. Now let me deal with one other thing that's a part of this that I haven't mentioned. There are some people who aren't interested in the conversation. Okay, they're not interested in a conversation. You want to have a conversation, but they don't. Okay, they think you want to debate them. You come in and you want to have a conversation, and they still want to have a debate. It may take a little bit of work to shift the game from a debate to a conversation. You're going to want to try and do that with someone like that. But there may come a point where you realize, you know what? It doesn't matter how I go about doing this. They're not interested in a conversation. They are as dug in as I am, just on the other side. Okay? And then you recognize this is going to be a wonderful exercise in sharing oxygen together. Okay? We're just going to share the same oxygen and we're going to get nowhere. Okay? You're going to realize. So that's... And that, again, everything that I'm saying, there's not a thing that I'm saying that applies to the right or the left. Everything that I'm saying applies to all of us. Yep, up here. Well, or unless you had... Right, over here. Huh? Over here. Oh, okay, over here. You'll go next. Okay, over here. Go. Oh.
Okay, we have some friends that we can kind of begin to skirt around the area of faith and what we believe, but we can't go very far before this one guy, the husband, begins to bring up things. What kind of a God would do this or do that? But you can see that underneath that there's just this anger welling up. That says if I could parse this, I need to figure out what the anger is about.
I just asked, what makes you so angry?
That's my question. How tactful should you be?
I think you can say, I think I can sense blood pressure's changing here. Okay, I probably wouldn't say it quite that way, but I sense that the temperature in the room is rising, that there's something that has you very worked up. Okay, I can see that. I appreciate the fact that that's how you're responding. Can you flesh that out for me a little bit? Okay. Probe. Just probe. He may or may not want to raise it. Sometimes people get angry and they don't know why they're angry. They're just angry. That I don't agree with this. Why? I can't believe you asked me that question. I have no idea why. Okay? All right? I just know in my gut, that's what I feel. That may be all that you get. But if you're visibly responding to a signal that they are sending to you, because he is sending smoke signals, all right? He is smoking while he's talking, all right? He's sending smoke. If you acknowledge that smoke signal and then respectfully ask what's behind it, okay? You put that person in a position where they have to engage or step back. Oh, I wasn't really angry. Oh, okay, good. Well, let's proceed then. Or maybe you get a reason. That may be worth knowing. It may be like my grandmother-in-law. There may be a reason in her experience that triggers the anger that's worth your knowing about as you're sharing in this area, that kind of thing. That's the value of getting the GPS reading. Okay? It helps you to know the game you're playing in the conversation. Okay, we're over here.
So you were talking about without God or knowledge, people will go to a place that makes sense. In my head, I was visualizing in kind of an elemental way where things are bouncing off a kinetic energy of everybody's moving and they're going to go to that comfortable kind of
In
position.
that self-defined place.
Right. So where in that, if they're sitting still, I feel like I've seen it a lot of times. I've seen what you're talking about too. Now I'm deciding there's probably a bridge between that place where they sit and rest in the natural place for a human without the knowledge of God to go. Where does that God-shaped void that I have seen so many times, especially where we live, when does that start opening up? Because I feel like it's almost as soon as someone sits in that rest of where they naturally will go, there's an element of discontent after a while that has to be identified and debated within their head, and then
You
it
just
becomes
went to the
God-shaped
place
void.
you need to go, which is, it's a simple question. Is that place working for you?
And it isn't.
Yeah, a lot of times you'll get, it's not all it's cracked up to be. Okay, you might get a waffle. Okay, all right, we all like those waffles. So, you might get a waffle when you get the answer to that question. But is it working for you? Do you think there could be something better? You could open it up by suggesting there might be an alternative. What you're trying to do there is you're trying to play with their imagination. You're trying to help them probe where they've landed. They may have just landed there by default. This is the best I can do.
Right.
Okay? And then open up that question. And then see where it goes. The hard part about what I'm talking to you about is that what you do next depends on what answer you get. And so I can't give you a rule, that's going to fit all situations. Some of this requires wisdom, okay, a thing called wisdom, which the Bible, wisdom is not knowledge. No. And so sometimes it requires wisdom, which is why we need to be prayerful in how we have these conversations, because in the end, we have to be relying on the Spirit to help guide us in these conversations. All the way in the back over here. Oh, he has to have effort. You're next after this, okay? Go.
I think I know the answer, but I wanted to
That's okay.
touch on it. That demonization earlier on was, it seems like a lot of times if I get into conversations with people, get accused of being a hater for
Right? They're doing it to you.
Is that a dead end for?
No, not necessarily. It depends on, again, part of this depends on where your conversation partner is coming from and how much they're interested in a conversation versus a debate. Sometimes it may take saying, you know what, I'm not interested in a debate here. I'm just trying to understand why you see the world differently than I do. Okay? And you're trying to bring the temperature of the conversation down and get it into the topics that you want to talk about. So yeah, they can say, and I might even say, you know what, when you say I'm a hater, I might recognize that you're identifying me with people who I also might recognize are haters, but that's not me. Please don't identify me with them. Okay? That's another way to deal with sometimes I tell people, oh, do I want to talk about this? I was in a meeting. This was 2 years ago now, almost 2 years ago, in Dallas. The World Evangelical Alliance came to Dallas and met with about 20 of us. We were religious leaders in the Dallas area. And this is an international organization, and they said to us, the way the term it's the World Evangelical Alliance, the way the term evangelical is being turned into a political term is creating problems for us overseas. We need your help. What should we do? And so we were having a meeting about how this, and so someone in the midst of the response says, well, the reason why we have this problem is because of the media. They were going to blame the media. Okay, media is, a whipping boy for everybody. And so the reason we have this problem is because of the media. The media always portrays Christians in a negative light. And so that's what's happened, and that's why we're there. And I spoke up, and I said, the media latches on to people who are out there, who represent a segment of our community, and who reflect the things that they're talking about. This isn't creation ex nihilo. If we don't acknowledge that exists, we don't have credibility in how we respond. And so that's the hater thing. The hater thing is, the reason Christians get identified as haters is there are Christians out there who are pretty good at hating and have communicated it pretty clearly. And they're real and they're out there. And what I want to do is separate myself from them. And then have a conversation with the person I'm having the conversation with. And go from there. So that might be a way of deflecting that kind of association. But when someone accuses you of something that you feel like is not who you are, okay, I think you say, that's not who I am. I'd like to talk about this. And I hope I don't accuse you of being something you don't feel like you are. And if I handle it that way, I might open up a space for a conversation. The humble thing that I talked about, that's when humility demonstrates itself.
So how might these principles be relevant within a youth culture characterized by diminishing depth in communication?
Characterized by what? I missed the first term.
Characterized by diminishing depth in
By diminishing depth? Is that what you said?
Depth. Depth.
Oh, by diminishing depth?
Depth.
D-E-P-T-H?
Yes.
Ooh. The challenge is to work hard to make sure our youth aren't shallow. I think I talked about this last night when I said we've tried to protect our kids from what's going on around us, and therefore they're not equipped to deal with what's going on around us. That is creating a shallow space. It's done, please hear me, it's done out of a good motive. It's done out of an attempt to protect the child. But it doesn't protect the child. That's the problem. And so it's much better directly engaged and creating a space where depth can be developed than it is leaving the space shallow. Okay, so that's one part of the answer. What were the other two things? What were the other two things you had? You wrote it down, so I'm sure you've got it. Yeah.
As far as these principles go, because of their lacking depth in the communication,
Right.
How would you apply these? How would you help them at their level?
I would actually help them think about the way conversations work. I would do something like what I've done with you, with them. Once they hit junior high and high school layer level, they can handle this. Okay? So I would talk about how to have those I would have them in my youth group. What I might be inclined to do on occasion is to have a conversation about the conversations they're having with their non-believing friends. And to pool that conversation and teach everybody by what some of them are going through. And to develop depth that way. This is the questions we're facing. This is what I'm up against. Someone called me a hater. You know, I'm sure it isn't just happening with people who have gray hair. Okay? It's probably happening all the way down the line. So you develop depth by engaging and teaching them how to engage. I have no idea who's next.
I'm up here in the sound booth.
Sound booth's got a question. Wow.
Hey, just quick question about when you approach a conversation, wanting to have a conversation, and the other person wants to have a debate. Are there some tactics you can share to change their approach to be more conversational?
I think you're just honest. I'm not here to have a fight. I'm not here to have a fight. I'm actually legitimately interested in where you're coming from and why. So I do everything I try and do to turn the temperature down. Okay? Now, there may be later when I'm in an assessment mode in this conversation where the conflict is there, it's real, and it has to be acknowledged, and you're engaged in a debate. And that's appropriate. But hopefully you've laid a sufficient relational foundation for being in that space. That's why I talked about earlier. It's one thing to understand, it's another thing to assess. But the way our conversation should proceed is I should work for understanding before I move into assessment. Most of us leap to assessment. We're taught to leap to assessment. That's wrong. I'm going to react. That's what we're taught. Okay.
So we are to engage people in the context of love and respect, and in the context of truth. Addressing issues can be almost an endless endeavor. The goal, if I'm understanding correctly, ultimately, my goal is to share the gospel. Mm-hmm. Because Christ changes the heart.
Yeah.
And so our goal, we shouldn't lose sight of the ultimate goal, which is to draw them or to lead them into the truth, which God can then bring them to Christ. And we could talk about things forever, but the things aren't going to change them. Christ is going to change them. So is that an accurate goal, which is Christ in their lives?
Here's the question. Can I show the gospel as well as talk about it? Okay, let me tell you why I'm saying this. If you look at the ministry of Jesus, he didn't go around bragging that he was the Messiah or the Son of God for the most part. He showed who he was and he showed God's care. That was part of bringing the gospel to people. And so there's this bifurcation in people's minds that sometimes suggests I have to say it with words. Eventually you are going to have to say it with words. But there is a whole lot of gospel preparation and gospel work that happens by how you treat people. And for me, I think we have underestimated the power of that kind of witness and what it takes to get there. And what I've suggested to you is it makes the sharing part easier to have that be effective if I have built the relational bridge to go there. And so I don't want to pit these things against one another, which is sort of what your question might do. It might say, I can talk about these spaces until I'm blue in the face and never get to the gospel. No, I'm trying to say to you, even the way I talk about this is reflective of a gospel commitment and of a gospel message. When someone says to me, I know you don't agree with where I am, so how is it that you show that you care so much? And that happens. I have shared and incarnated gospel truth. Because God loves the world, and God cares for people in the world, and so he took the initiative to care for them. That's what I'm trying to do. Okay? I'm in gospel space. I may not be in the specific space of what the response is, but I've laid groundwork that is essential, okay, to having that message when I get there make sense. It's actually what I've been trying to say to you these last 2 days. There is a whole series of things that are a part of getting to where the gospel can make sense for someone. You know, the scripture says the gospel is foolishness to the natural man. This is why. Okay? It has to be interpreted spiritually. But the only way I do that is by modeling the spiritual dimensions and the relational dimensions of what is going on so that people can see it and be opened up to it. I think it's one of the ways the Spirit opens up people for the gospel who previously were not oriented towards it. And so, yes, eventually I'm going to want to share, how Christ died for sin, has taken your place, has paid the cost, and I don't want to forget this, and it's made provision for you to walk with him for the rest of your life. If I don't have that last piece, I don't have the gospel. And so I want to be sure I get there, but I want to relate to the person in such a way that that last piece makes sense when I say it. That's what I'm after.
One of the tribes I was in was 15 years with World Vision, the largest Christian humanitarian organization.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've been away since 2010, and I guess my point's going to be the impact of social media, but looking at all of the saboteurs of good conversation, when they were gunny-sacked on me, I found I was just overwhelmed. I made one comment with the group about, I wish the immigrants would come in under the law.
Mm-hmm.
That little piece, and all of a sudden, I was demonized, and these people knew me really well in many, many different countries and what's happened in my life since and so forth. But all of a sudden, with one little statement, I found this gunny sacking of demonization and couldn't parse the issues. And there were 25 issues that we probably were on the same side of. But I didn't know how to step back. No, I wanted to understand.
That's why the example that I gave earlier about how we got to where we are on immigration is so important, okay? Because we did things to the immigration discussion that put us in the position that we're in, that we are not acknowledging. Yes, we want people to follow our laws, but for more than 2 decades, probably closer to 3, we didn't follow our own laws and encourage the behavior that allowed people in and said, you can come here, you can work our jobs, just don't violate our laws, and you can have children, and you can have the new life here, and the laws that we've written we're not paying attention to, and we're not going to blame you for that. And then all of a sudden we're blaming them for that.
I just mentioned one of many things going
Sure.
on that they knew about me before, and all of a sudden we're all Christians, and I could have said something else like, I believe we should love the sinner and hate the sin, in terms of sexual morality and so forth, all kinds of sexual morality. But all of a sudden it was the gunny sack of every kind of political issue that's out there. And I didn't know how to get the conversation.
And so what I try and do, although this is sometimes hard because sometimes you're in raw political space. What I try and do is to try and be clear about what Christian principles are in play in the way I'm thinking as opposed to political principles. And try and turn those conversations into those kinds of. Now, what's hard here is that sometimes theology and politics overlap. Okay? So that sometimes you can't make that a total kind of separation. But you can make some observations that will kind of throw people off. Let me give you an example, okay? And I'm going to have to ask for your patience again, because I'm going to say something that will be challenging. Most people who comment on Marxism have not read Karl Marx, okay? And Das Kapital, which is the book that he wrote. Which he wrote to deal with injustices in the way in which child labor and laborers were handled by businesses. It was the basis of his critique of capitalism, was the way that capitalism treats workers. And he listed all, in the first 300 pages, he lists all kinds of abuses of what employers were doing with employees. In virtually every case that he mentioned, we now have laws that protect the employee from the kind of abuse that he was pointing out. And so I go, all right, I'm not a Marxist. I have no interest in being a Marxist. I think Marxism has all kinds of problems. But this Marxist, like the Marxist, okay, was pointing out things of injustice that I as a Christian can recognize are unjust. Do we have that skill anymore? Are we able to think in that kind of, I can think about this Christianly without thinking about it in a Marxist kind of way and say, the way people are being treated here is simply wrong. May not be for the reasons that Marx says and wants to apply a solution to, but it's wrong and needs to be dealt with. Because people shouldn't be treated this way. Can we develop that ability? And the moment I do that, I'm communicating a sensitivity to people that transcends politics and that's rooted in my Christian faith. The church needs to keep eyes open like that.
I think you just want to do one more question, then take a break?
Yeah, fair enough.
Okay, Mr. Sam.
So this comment is rooted in what you just said, but
Okay.
I feel obligated to say it. Intellectually and biblically, I agree with everything you say and I trust you. But viscerally, I feel like you're asking us to compromise. I feel like you're asking us to become more liberal, and I just don't like it. Can you speak to that?
I sure can. My answer is, how vulnerable was Jesus Christ to the world? How vulnerable was Jesus Christ to the world? Was it a comfortable space that he walked into? Was it a place where you went, this is just what you were doing? Jesus Christ walked into a space in which he said, I am going to be treated unjustly. Here's the irony of it. I'm going to be treated unjustly for the sake of biblical justice. I'm going to be vulnerable. The reason it's uncomfortable, I think, is because it makes us vulnerable. And that vulnerability is very uncomfortable because in the end, I have to trust God with the results. And so we're back to where we were in 1 Peter 3. Why do we do it this way? Why would anyone love their enemies? Why would anyone do that? That's crazy. Okay, that's what some people think. It's crazy to love your enemies. But Jesus isn't making that as an option. He's saying this is fundamental to who we're supposed to be. Does that make me comfortable? No. Do I understand your gut reaction? Absolutely. That's why I've been so careful about how I've said everything. Because I know what it does viscerally to people. Because people are trying to cling and hang on to something they feel like they're losing. And they're reacting out of that tension and maybe even fear. And in the end, I've got to say, do I believe the verse in the Bible that says this? Greater is he who is in us, how's the rest of the verse go, than he who is in the world. Do I really believe I can put myself in that position? And I think a lot of the church doesn't believe that verse. So, I so appreciate your asking the question, because I think that is the gut reaction a lot of people have. And then the question then becomes, I see the logic of what it is that you're saying. I get it. Man, I don't like it.